My daughter-in-law took out a $1,000 loan in my name to buy a house. On her housewarming day, she asked me, "How did you get here? Didn't think you'd leave the nursing home for this." I pointed to the bailiff, and her face went pale that second. But let me tell you how it all started. I'm Miriam, 72 years old, and until 3 months ago, I thought I knew exactly who my family was. My son Marcus had married Stephanie 5 years earlier, and I genuinely believed she was a blessing. Sweet, attentive, always asking about my health with those concerned dew eyes. She'd bring me homemade soup when I had a cold, remember my doctor's appointments, even help me organize my medications. After losing my husband Robert 2 years ago, Stephanie seemed like the daughter I never had. Before we continue, comment where you're watching from and subscribe to the channel. We'd love to see how far our stories are reaching. That Tuesday morning started like any other. I was tending to my rose garden, the one Robert and I had planted together 37 years ago, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed First National Bank, and my stomach immediately tightened. At my age, unexpected calls from financial institutions never bring good news. "Mrs. Harrison, this is Janet Miller from First National Bank. I'm calling regarding your home equity loan that's now 60 days past due. The payment of $4,147 was due on the 15th, and we haven't received it yet." I dropped my gardening gloves. "I'm sorry. There must be some mistake. I don't have any loans with your bank." The silence on the other end stretched uncomfortably long. "Ma'am, I'm looking at your account right here. You took out a $1 million home equity loan 6 months ago. The property address matches your residence, and we have your signature on all the paperwork." My legs gave out, and I sank onto my garden bench. $1 million. My house was worth maybe $300,000, and I owned it outright. That's impossible. I never signed anything. "Mrs. Harrison, I understand this might be confusing, but I have your social security number, driver's license information, and your signature. Would you like me to email you copies of the documents?" 20 minutes later, I sat at my kitchen table staring at papers that made my blood run cold. There was my signature, clear as day, on document after document. The loan officer's notes mentioned that I seemed slightly confused during the appointment, but was accompanied by my helpful daughter-in-law, who assisted with understanding the paperwork. Stephanie. My hands shook as I reached for my phone. Marcus answered on the second ring, his voice bright and cheerful. "Hey, Mom, what's up?" "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me." My voice cracked despite my efforts to stay calm. "Did you or Stephanie take out a loan using my name?" The pause was too long. When he finally spoke, his voice had changed. "Mom, what are you talking about?" "The bank just called me about a $1 million loan I apparently signed for 6 months ago. They said Stephanie was there with me." Another pause. "Mom, you've been forgetting things lately. Remember last month when you couldn't find your car keys? Maybe you just don't remember going to the bank." The words hit me like a physical blow. My own son was suggesting I was losing my mind. "Marcus, I have never forgotten anything important in my life. I balance my checkbook to the penny every month. I remember every doctor's appointment, every medication, every—" "Mom, please don't get upset. Stephanie mentioned you've seemed a little confused lately. Maybe we should make an appointment with Dr. Patterson to get you checked out." I hung up. My son, the boy I raised, the man I supported through college and his difficult divorce from his first wife, was choosing to believe I was senile rather than consider that his precious Stephanie might be lying. I called Stephanie directly. She answered in that sweet, concerned voice that now made my skin crawl. "Oh, Miriam, how are you feeling today?" "I'm feeling like someone stole $1 million from me." "Stephanie." "Oh, honey, you sound so stressed. Marcus told me you called him upset about some bank thing. You know how these banks can be with their confusing paperwork. Why don't I come over and we can sort this out together?" "Don't you dare come to my house." "Miriam, please, I'm worried about you." "I'm worried. You've been so forgetful lately, and I think the grief from losing Robert is affecting your memory more than you realize. Maybe it's time we looked into some nice assisted living facilities where you could have more support." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, my heart hammering so hard I could hear it in my ears. Assisted living facilities. She was already planning to put me away. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the times Stephanie had been so helpful, so concerned about my well-being, how she'd insisted on organizing my important papers so they'd be easier to find, how she'd offered to handle my banking when I mentioned the online system was confusing, how she'd suggested I add her as an authorized person on my accounts, just in case of emergencies. I had trusted her completely. She had seemed like such a godsend after Robert died, when the loneliness felt like it might swallow me whole. She made me feel like I still mattered to someone, like I wasn't just a burden waiting to die. But now I saw it differently. She hadn't been taking care of me. She had been studying me, learning my routines, my weaknesses, my fears. She had been planning this for years, waiting for the perfect moment when I was most vulnerable. The next morning, I called my attorney, David Reeves, who had handled Robert's estate. David, I need your help. Someone has committed fraud in my name, and I think they're planning to have me declared incompetent. When I explained everything, his voice turned grim. Miriam, this is more serious than simple fraud. If someone is positioning to have you declared incompetent while simultaneously controlling your finances, they're essentially planning to steal your entire life. We need to act fast. 3 weeks later, I had my answer. The investigation David hired revealed that Stephanie had done this before. Her previous mother-in-law, an 80-year-old widow named Margaret Chen, had died in a care facility after Stephanie had her declared incompetent and gained control of her finances. Margaret's own children had been convinced their mother was suffering from dementia. Stephanie wasn't just a fraud. She was a predator who targeted vulnerable older women, and I was her latest victim. But she had made one crucial mistake. She underestimated me. Now that I knew what Stephanie really was, I started remembering things differently. All those moments I had treasured as signs of her love and care suddenly looked like something else entirely. The sweet, concerned daughter-in-law had been a carefully crafted performance, and I had been the perfect audience. It started right after Robert's funeral. I was drowning in grief, barely able to function, when Stephanie appeared at my door with a casserole and that gentle smile. Miriam, you shouldn't be alone right now. Let me help you with some of these arrangements. At the time, I was grateful. Dealing with insurance companies, banks, and Robert's retirement accounts felt overwhelming. When Stephanie offered to help me organize the paperwork, I nearly cried with relief. She was so patient, so understanding, making neat little files and explaining everything in simple terms. See how confusing they make these forms? She'd say, shaking her head sympathetically. No wonder you're having trouble with this. Here, let me just fill this part out for you. I thought she was being kind. Now I realize she was mapping out my entire financial life. She convinced me to add her as an authorized user on my bank accounts. Just for emergencies, Miriam. What if something happens to you and Marcus needs to access funds quickly? We just want to make sure you're protected. The way she said we made me feel like I was part of something, like I wasn't facing my widowhood alone. I signed the papers without hesitation, but it was the small things that should have warned me. How she'd purse her lips slightly when I mentioned plans to travel or take a class. Are you sure that's wise at your age, Miriam? These tour groups can be so unpredictable, and you know how easily you get tired. I wasn't tired. I was lonely, but I wasn't frail. Yet somehow, after each conversation with Stephanie, I felt a little more uncertain about my capabilities, a little more dependent on her guidance. She had a way of making me question my own judgment while appearing completely supportive. When I mentioned wanting to volunteer at the local hospital, she'd say, "Oh, that sounds wonderful. Although, didn't you tell me last week that you forgot where you put your reading glasses? Maybe we should wait until after your next doctor's appointment, just to make sure everything's okay." I never told her I forgot my glasses. I began to wonder if I was losing my memory after all. The isolation happened so gradually, I didn't notice it at first. Stephanie would arrive just as my friend Carol was leaving. "Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't know you had company. I just wanted to check on you, but I can come back later." She'd look hurt, like she was only trying to help. Carol started visiting less frequently. "I don't want to interfere with family time," she'd say. Soon, my small circle of friends dwindled to almost nothing. Stephanie became my primary social contact, and she made sure I knew how much she sacrificed for me. "I worry about you being here all alone," she'd say, settling into Robert's old chair like she belonged there. "Marcus works such long hours, and I know he feels guilty that he can't check on you more often. That's why I try to come by every day. I hope you don't mind." Mind? I was pathetically grateful. I looked forward to her visits like a lifeline. She brought me small gifts, a puzzle, a book, a plant for my garden. Each gesture reinforced how much I needed her, how lost I'd be without her care. But now I saw the calculation behind every kindness. The puzzle was too difficult, making me feel stupid when I couldn't complete it. The book was about memory loss in elderly people. The plant required specific care instructions that she'd written out in large print, as if I couldn't read normal-sized text anymore. She was systematically undermining my confidence while positioning herself as my savior. The most insidious part was how she managed Marcus. Every time I called my son with a concern or just to chat, somehow the conversation would circle back to Stephanie's observations about my well-being. "Mom, Stephanie mentioned you seemed confused about what day it was when she visited Tuesday," Marcus would say. And didn't you tell her you couldn't remember if you'd taken your morning pills? I never said either of those things. But when I protested, Marcus would get that patient tone in his voice, the one you use with children or people who aren't quite all there. Mom, it's okay. We all forget things. Stephanie's just looking out for you. Stephanie was creating a narrative about my declining mental state, and Marcus was buying every word of it. She'd plant little seeds of doubt, always with love and concern. I'm worried about Miriam leaving the stove on yesterday. She insisted she turned it off, but when I checked, the burner was still on low. I didn't want to embarrass her by mentioning it. She never mentioned it to me either, because it never happened. But Marcus didn't know that. The medical appointments started about a year after Robert died. Stephanie would call and say she'd made an appointment with Dr. Patterson because she was concerned about some symptoms she'd noticed. Forgetfulness, confusion, difficulty managing daily tasks. I made notes, she'd tell the doctor, pulling out a small notebook. Thursday, she couldn't remember our phone conversation from the day before. Friday, she got lost driving to the grocery store she's been going to for 20 years. I would sit there, bewildered, because none of these things had happened. But Dr. Patterson would nod sympathetically and order tests for cognitive decline. When the tests came back normal, Stephanie would look worried. Sometimes these things are hard to detect in early stages, she'd murmur. She was building a medical record of my supposed incompetence. The house renovation she suggested made sense at the time. These stairs are so dangerous, Miriam. What if you fell? And this bathroom. The tub is so high. We should make some modifications to keep you safe. She arranged for grab bars in the bathroom, a ramp over the front steps, even a medical alert button. Just in case, she'd say. We want you to be able to stay in your home as long as possible. Every modification made my house look more like an elderly care facility and less like the home of a competent adult. When friends or neighbors visited, they'd see the grab bars and alert button and assume I was frailer than I actually was. But the cruelest manipulation was how she used my grief against me. On Robert's birthday, on our anniversary, on holidays we'd celebrated together, Stephanie would show up with tissues and gentle words. I know today is hard for you. You don't have to pretend to be strong all the time. She encouraged my sadness, my vulnerability, my dependence on her comfort. She made me feel like grieving was all I was capable of, like moving forward would somehow dishonor Robert's memory. She kept me frozen in that widow's role, helpless and needy. Now I understood why. A grieving, confused, dependent widow was much easier to control than a sharp, independent woman who might ask uncomfortable questions about missing money. The most chilling realization was that she had done all of this while making me love her for it. I had genuinely believed she cared about me, that I was lucky to have such a devoted daughter-in-law. I had trusted her with my loneliness, my fears, my future, and she had used every single piece of that trust to destroy me. The invitation arrived on cream-colored cardstock with elegant gold lettering. You're invited to celebrate our new home, it read, with Stephanie and Marcus's names embossed at the bottom. My new home, the house bought with $1 million stolen from me. I stared at that invitation for 3 days, my anger building with each passing hour. They had the audacity to invite me to celebrate their theft. But then I realized something crucial. This was exactly the opportunity I needed. The investigation David had hired was complete. We had evidence of Stephanie's pattern with Margaret Chen, forged signatures on my loan documents, and medical records showing I was perfectly competent despite her claims otherwise. The authorities were ready to act, but they needed Stephanie to be served with the papers. She'd been avoiding going home, staying at Marcus's office or her sister's house, but she couldn't avoid her own housewarming party. I called Marcus the morning of the party. Honey, I just wanted to confirm I'll be there tonight. The surprise in his voice was unmistakable. Mom, you're actually coming? Of course I'm coming. It's such a special occasion. My voice was steady, giving nothing away. I want to see this beautiful house Stephanie's been telling me about. Well, that's great. Stephanie will be so happy. I doubted that. I spent the afternoon getting ready with more care than I had in months. I chose my navy blue dress, the one Robert had always said made my eyes sparkle. I did my hair and makeup, put on the pearl earrings Marcus had given me for Christmas years ago. If this was going to be my last performance as the confused, helpless widow, I was going to look dignified doing it. The house was magnificent, a sprawling colonial in Meadowbrook Estates, the kind of neighborhood I could never have afforded even in my prime earning years. Luxury cars lined the circular driveway, and warm light spilled from every window. My stolen money had bought Stephanie quite the showcase. I parked across the street and sat in my car for a moment, watching well-dressed guests filter through the front door. These people had no idea they were celebrating a crime. They saw a successful young couple who'd worked hard for their dream home. The irony made my stomach churn. The doorbell chimed as I pressed it, and within seconds Stephanie appeared, radiant in a flowing emerald dress that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Her smile froze when she saw me. "Miriam, what a surprise." She recovered quickly, but I caught that moment of shock. "How did you get here?" "I drove, dear, same as everyone else." "Oh." She glanced over my shoulder as if expecting to see someone else. "I just didn't think you'd leave the nursing home for this." The words hit the doorstep like a slap. Several guests within earshot turned to look, their expressions shifting from polite interest to uncomfortable pity. In one sentence, Stephanie had painted me as an elderly woman who lived in institutional care, someone so frail that leaving would be unusual. "I don't live in a nursing home, Stephanie. I live in my own house, remember? The one you've been so concerned about." Of course. I misspoke. But the damage was done. The nearby guests were already whispering, creating their own narrative about the confused elderly woman who didn't even realize where she lived. Stephanie stepped aside to let me in, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. She was already planning how to minimize my presence, how to manage whatever disruption I might cause. The house was stunning. Hardwood floors gleamed under crystal chandeliers, and expensive artwork lined the walls. The kitchen featured granite countertops and top-of-the-line appliances. The living room boasted a massive stone fireplace and furniture that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Every beautiful detail was a reminder of my stolen money. "Miriam," Marcus appeared, giving me a careful hug as if I might break. "I'm so glad you came. How are you feeling?" "I'm feeling quite well, thank you. This house is lovely. It must have cost a fortune." Marcus and Stephanie exchanged a quick glance. "We've been saving for years," Marcus said. "Stephanie's been so good about budgeting and planning. I'm sure she has." As the evening progressed, I watched Stephanie work the room like a professional hostess. She had a gift for making everyone feel welcome and important, the same skill she'd used to make me trust her completely. But now I could see the performance underneath the warmth. She kept a careful eye on me, appearing at my elbow whenever I started talking to other guests for too long. "Miriam, why don't you sit down? You look tired." Or, "Miriam, are you sure you should have that wine? You know how it affects your medications." I wasn't taking any medications that interacted with alcohol, but the other guests didn't know that. They saw a concerned daughter-in-law looking after her elderly mother-in-law's health. Each comment reinforced the image she'd been building of me as someone who needed constant supervision. The cruelest moment came when she introduced me to a group of her friends. "This is Marcus's mother, Miriam. We've been taking such good care of her since she became, well, since she's needed more help." One of the women, a perfectly coiffed blonde, smiled sympathetically. "It's so wonderful that you're so devoted to family, Stephanie. Not everyone would take on that kind of responsibility." "Oh, we couldn't possibly put her in a home," Stephanie replied, her voice dripping with false virtue. "Family takes care of family even when it gets challenging. Challenging, as if I were a burden they'd nobly shouldered instead of a victim they'd systematically robbed." I excused myself and walked to the bathroom, partly to escape their toxic conversation, and partly to gather my courage for what was coming next. In the mirror, I looked like exactly what I was, a well-dressed, sharp-eyed woman who was nobody's fool, not the confused invalid Stephanie had been describing. When I returned to the living room, Stephanie was holding court near the fireplace, telling the story of how they'd found this perfect house. "We knew the moment we walked in that this was meant to be our home. Sometimes you just have to take a leap of faith and trust that everything will work out. Trust that everything will work out." The audacity was breathtaking. I glanced at my watch. 8:30. The guests would be here for at least another hour, providing the perfect audience for what was about to happen. I pulled out my phone and sent a simple text. "Ready?" Within 10 minutes, the doorbell rang. Stephanie, busy charming a group of neighbors, didn't notice at first. But Marcus frowned and moved toward the door. "I'll get it," I said, intercepting him smoothly. "You stay with your guests." I opened the door to find Officer Rodriguez and Bailiff Thompson standing on the porch, official documents in hand. Behind them stood David Reeves, my attorney, and Detective Sarah Kim from the Fraud Division. "Mrs. Harrison," Officer Rodriguez said formally, "we're here to serve papers to Stephanie Morris Harrison." The conversation in the living room began to die as people noticed the uniforms in the doorway. Stephanie looked up from her group, her face puzzled at first, then increasingly pale as she realized what was happening. "Is Stephanie Morris Harrison present?" the bailiff called out, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet room. Every eye in the house turned toward Stephanie. She stood frozen by the fireplace, wine glass trembling in her hand. As the weight of her crimes finally caught up with her, I pointed directly at her, my voice clear and strong. Right there, the one in the emerald dress. Her face went completely white, and I saw something I'd never seen before in all our years of acquaintance. For the first time since I'd known her, Stephanie looked genuinely afraid. Chapter 4. The Web of Lies Unravels. The silence in that elegant living room was deafening. 30 guests stood frozen, wine glasses suspended halfway to their lips, as they watched Stephanie's carefully constructed world collapse in real time. Stephanie Morris Harrison, Officer Rodriguez announced. Stepping into the house, you're under arrest for identity theft, elder fraud, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. Stephanie's wine glass slipped from her fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor she'd bought with my money. Red wine spread across the gleaming surface like blood. There's been some mistake, she whispered, but her voice cracked on every word. Ma'am, please turn around and place your hands behind your back. Wait! Marcus stepped forward, his face a mixture of confusion and panic. What's going on? Mom, what did you do? The accusation in his voice cut deep, but I'd expected it. Even faced with police officers arresting his wife, his first instinct was to blame me. I didn't do anything, Marcus. I reported a crime. Detective Kim stepped forward, pulling out a thick folder. Mr. Harrison, your wife used your mother's identity to secure a $1 million loan. She forged Mrs. Harrison's signature on multiple documents and has been systematically trying to have her declared mentally incompetent. That's impossible, Marcus said, but his voice wavered. My mother has been having memory problems. Stephanie's been helping her. Your mother passed every cognitive assessment we administered, Detective Kim replied. She's sharper than most people half her age. I watched my son's face as the reality began to sink in. The woman he'd married, the woman he'd chosen over his own mother, was a criminal who'd been manipulating him just as thoroughly as she'd manipulated me. Stephanie finally found her voice. This is ridiculous. Miriam's been confused for months. She probably doesn't even remember signing those papers. She needs help, not enabling. Actually, David Reeves stepped forward. We have security footage from the bank showing you forging Mrs. Harrison's signature. We also have testimony from the loan officer who was uncomfortable with the transaction, but was pressured to proceed. The guests began murmuring among themselves. I caught fragments of conversation. Identity theft, elder abuse, how horrible. The same people who'd been looking at me with pity 20 minutes ago were now staring at Stephanie with disgust. Furthermore, Detective Kim continued, we've discovered this isn't your first offense. You did the same thing to Margaret Chen, your previous mother-in-law, before she died in a care facility. A collective gasp went up from the crowd. Stephanie's face went from white to gray. Margaret had dementia. I was trying to help her. Margaret Chen's autopsy revealed elevated levels of sleep medication in her system, Detective Kim said quietly. Levels consistent with deliberate dosing over several months. My blood turned to ice. Margaret hadn't just died. Stephanie had killed her. Marcus stumbled backward as if he'd been physically struck. No, that's not. Stephanie wouldn't. Your wife is a predator who targets vulnerable elderly women, Detective Kim said. She marries into families, gains their trust, isolates her victims from support systems, and then systematically steals their assets while positioning them for institutionalization or worse. The officer was placing handcuffs on Stephanie's wrists, but she wasn't done fighting. You're all making a terrible mistake. Miriam's mind is going. She's paranoid, confused. She probably called you because she forgot she signed the papers. Mrs. Morris Harrison, I said, stepping closer so she could see my face clearly. I remember everything. Every lie you told, every document you forged, every time you tried to convince my son I was losing my mind. Her mask finally slipped completely. The sweet, concerned daughter-in-law disappeared, replaced by something cold and calculating. You stupid old woman. You have no idea what you've done. Marcus will never forgive you for this. Maybe not, I said calmly, but at least he'll be alive to make that choice. The implications hung in the air like smoke. If Stephanie had killed Margaret, what had she been planning for me? As they led her toward the door, Stephanie made one last desperate play. Marcus, please. You know me. You know I would never hurt anyone. Your mother's been acting strange for months. The grief made her paranoid. For a moment, Marcus wavered. I could see him wanting to believe her, wanting to cling to the illusion that his wife was innocent. But Detective Kim pulled out another folder. Mr. Harrison, we found these in your wife's personal safe. She held up a stack of papers, commitment papers for your mother, already filled out and notarized. She was planning to have Mrs. Harrison involuntarily committed within the month. Marcus's face crumpled. The papers were proof that Stephanie hadn't just stolen from me. She'd been planning to erase me entirely. There's more, Detective Kim continued. Medication records show she'd been ordering sleep aids and anxiety medications online, having them delivered to various addresses. The same drugs found in Margaret Chen's system. I felt sick. How long had she been drugging me? Those nights when I felt unusually tired after her visits, when I'd wake up groggy and disoriented. I'd chalked it up to grief and aging. But it had been Stephanie, slowly poisoning me, preparing to use my supposed mental decline as justification for taking control of my life. She also had research on your mother's life insurance policies, Detective Kim added, and she'd been inquiring about burial plots. The room erupted in horrified whispers. Stephanie hadn't just been planning to steal my money and have me committed. She'd been planning my death. Marcus sank into one of the expensive chairs Stephanie had bought with my stolen money. "Oh God, Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you. I should have believed you." "You couldn't have known," I said, though part of me was still angry at how quickly he'd dismissed my concerns. She was very good at what she did. As they escorted Stephanie out, she turned back one last time. "This isn't over, Miriam. You think you've won, but you've destroyed this family. Marcus will hate you for this." "No," I said firmly. "You destroyed this family the moment you decided to prey on us." The door closed behind her, and suddenly the beautiful house felt empty and cold. The guests began filing out, whispering among themselves, probably relieved to escape the scene. Within an hour, the house was silent except for Marcus, myself, and David. Marcus sat with his head in his hands. 5 years. I was married to her for 5 years. How did I not see it? "Because she was a professional," David said gently. "We've been investigating cases like this for months. Stephanie had a whole system. She targeted widowed women through grief counseling groups, church organizations, community centers. She'd study their children, their finances, their vulnerabilities. But why Margaret? Why my first mother-in-law? Practice," Detective Kim said, returning from processing the scene. "Margaret was her trial run. She learned what worked and what didn't. By the time she met your mother, she'd perfected her technique. I thought about Margaret Chen, dying alone in a care facility, while everyone believed she had dementia. How many others had there been? How many elderly women had Stephanie destroyed before I stopped her?" "What happens now?" Marcus asked. "Your wife will likely face federal charges," Detective Kim explained. "Elder fraud, identity theft, possibly murder in Margaret's case. She's looking at decades in prison. And the money? The loan will be voided since it was obtained through fraud. The house will likely be seized as proceeds of a crime. Your mother should be able to recover most of her losses, though it may take time." Marcus looked around the living room, at all the beautiful things Stephanie had filled it with. "None of this was real, was it? Our whole life together." "I'm sorry, son," I said softly. "But no, it wasn't real." He nodded slowly, tears finally starting to fall. "Mom, can you ever forgive me? I chose her over you. I let her convince me you were losing your mind. I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved, who'd been as much a victim of Stephanie's manipulation as I had been. We were both fooled, Marcus. The important thing is that we stopped her before she could hurt anyone else." But even as I said the words, I wondered if that was true. Had we really stopped her in time? Or had she already set other plans in motion? And how many other families were out there, still trapped in Stephanie's web of lies? 2 weeks after Stephanie's arrest, I found myself sitting in a sterile conference room at the county jail, waiting for what would likely be our last conversation. My attorney David had advised against this meeting, but I needed to look her in the eye one more time. I needed answers that only she could provide. The door opened, and Stephanie shuffled in wearing an orange jumpsuit, her hands shackled. Gone was the perfectly styled hair, the designer clothes, the sweet smile that had fooled so many people. She looked smaller somehow, ordinary in a way that made her previous performance seem even more calculated. She sat across from me, her eyes hard and defiant. "I wondered when you'd come gloating." "I'm not here to gloat, Stephanie. I'm here for the truth." She laughed, a bitter sound that echoed off the concrete walls. "The truth? You couldn't handle the truth, Miriam. You lived in your little bubble of widowed grief, feeling sorry for yourself, begging for someone to care about you. I gave you exactly what you wanted. You gave me poison disguised as kindness. I gave you purpose. Before I came along, you were just another lonely old woman waiting to die. I made you feel needed, important. You should be thanking me." The audacity was breathtaking, but I kept my voice steady. "How many others were there, Stephanie? How many women did you kill?" Her expression didn't change. "Kill? That's a strong word. I simply helped them transition more peacefully than they would have otherwise. Margaret Chen, How did you murder her? Margaret was suffering. Her son lived across the country, never visited. She was depressed, isolated, exactly like you were. I gave her comfort in her final months by drugging her and stealing her money, by making sure she didn't suffer alone. Stephanie leaned forward, her voice dropping to a whisper. Do you know what it's like to die in one of those places, Miriam? The smell of disinfectant and urine, the sound of people crying out for help that never comes. Margaret died peacefully in her sleep. That's more mercy than most people get. While you emptied her bank accounts. Someone was going to inherit that money eventually. At least I put it to good use. I stared at this woman who had shared my table, who had held my hand during difficult moments, who had made me believe she cared about me. There wasn't a trace of remorse in her face, no recognition that she'd done anything wrong. What about the others? Margaret wasn't your first. Was she? Stephanie's smile was cold. You think you're so clever, but you only scratched the surface. Margaret was number 4. There was Eleanor in Tampa, heart medication overdose. Beverly in Phoenix, fell down the stairs after taking her sleeping pills. Catherine in Portland, mixed the wrong medications together. Poor thing. 7 women, 7 lives she'd ended for money. You're a serial killer. I'm a practical businesswoman. These women were lonely, vulnerable, desperate for connection. I provided that connection, and in return, they provided for my future. It's a fair exchange. They trusted you. Trust is a luxury they couldn't afford. Look at you, Miriam. Before I came along, you were withering away in that house, talking to your dead husband's pictures, barely eating. You were already dying, just slowly. I would have given you a better ending. You would have murdered me. I would have given you peace, and Marcus would have inherited everything anyway. Eventually. This way, he would have been spared years of watching you decline. The casual way she discussed my planned murder made my skin crawl. How long have you been doing this? 12 years, since my first husband died and left me with nothing but debt. I realized then that if I was going to survive, I had to be smarter than the system that abandoned me. Your first husband? Poor Gerald. Worked himself to death at 62, and the insurance company found a technicality to deny his life insurance. I was left with nothing. No savings, no pension, just a mountain of medical bills from his cancer treatment. For the first time, I saw something like genuine emotion in her face. Pain, anger, betrayal. So you decided to steal from other people? I decided to take what I deserved. Gerald worked for 40 years, paid his premiums, followed all the rules. And what did it get him? What did it get me? Nothing. The system failed us, so I made my own system. By preying on grieving widows, by providing comfort to women who had been discarded by their families, just like I was discarded by the insurance company, by Gerald's employers, by everyone who should have helped me. Her voice rose, the first crack in her composure. You think your precious Marcus would have taken care of you forever? Men don't want to deal with aging parents. They want to ship them off to nursing homes and visit on holidays. I was saving you from that humiliation. Marcus loves me. Marcus loves the idea of you. The strong, independent mother who doesn't need anything from him. But the moment you became a burden, needed help with medications, couldn't drive anymore, started repeating stories, he would have started looking at assisted living brochures just like every other son. There was truth in what she said, and that made it worse. I'd seen it happen to friends, their children gradually growing impatient with their needs, their limitations. But that didn't justify what she'd done. What about the insurance money? What was your plan for me? Natural causes. Heart attack brought on by stress and grief. You'd been showing signs of anxiety, depression. Dr. Patterson was already concerned about your mental state, thanks to my carefully documented observations. A sudden cardiac event wouldn't have surprised anyone. You had it all planned out. I always have it planned out. That's how I've survived this long. She leaned back, studying my face. You know what's funny? You actually ruined the perfect plan. Another few months, and you would have been declared incompetent. I would have had legal guardianship, control of all your assets. Your death would have been tragic but not suspicious. Marcus would have inherited everything through me, and I would have been the grieving daughter-in-law who tried so hard to help. Instead, you're facing life in prison, because you were too stubborn to die quietly. Her mask slipped completely now, revealing the cold predator underneath. Do you know how rare it is to find someone with your assets and your isolation? You were perfect. Wealthy enough to make it worthwhile, lonely enough to be grateful for attention, trusting enough to sign whatever I put in front of you, but I wasn't as helpless as you thought. No, you weren't. That was my mistake. I underestimated you. She paused, then smiled that same sweet smile that had fooled me for years. But I won't make that mistake again. The threat in her words was clear. Even sitting in jail, facing multiple murder charges, she was still thinking about her next victim. There won't be a next time, Stephanie. You're never getting out of here. You'd be surprised what good behavior and a sympathetic story can accomplish. Grieving widow driven to desperation by an unfair system? I might get out in 15 years, 20 at most. The prosecutor is seeking life without parole. Prosecutors seek a lot of things. Juries are more sympathetic, especially to women who've been victimized by the system. She leaned forward again, her voice dropping to that familiar, caring tone she'd used so many times before. Besides, Miriam, you know how forgetful elderly people can be. Witnesses die, memories fade, evidence gets lost. Time has a way of making everything unclear. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. I'd heard enough. This woman was beyond redemption, beyond human decency. She would kill again if given the chance, and she felt no remorse for the lives she'd already taken. Goodbye, Stephanie. This isn't over, Miriam. It's never over. I walked toward the door, but her voice stopped me one last time. Give my love to Marcus. Tell him I said goodbye. I turned back to look at her, this monster who had invaded our lives and nearly destroyed us. He never wants to see you again. He will. They always do. Men like Marcus need someone to take care of them, and he'll remember all the good times we had together. The sweet moments, the intimate conversations, the way I made him feel like the most important man in the world. You manipulated him. I loved him, in my own way. That's what made it so effective. Her smile was genuinely sad now. That's what you'll never understand, Miriam. I'm not just a predator. I'm someone who learned how to survive in a world that doesn't care about women like us. The only difference between you and me is that I refuse to be a victim. I left her sitting in that sterile room, still believing she was the hero of her own story. But as I walked out of the jail into the afternoon sunlight, I realized something important. She was wrong about one thing. I had refused to be a victim too. 6 months later, I stood in my garden watching the sunrise paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The roses Robert and I had planted were blooming again, their fragrance filling the morning air with sweetness. For the first time in years, I felt truly at peace. Stephanie had been sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The evidence against her was overwhelming. 7 murders, multiple counts of fraud, elder abuse, and conspiracy. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours. Justice, it seemed, sometimes actually worked. The house in Meadowbrook Estates had been seized and sold, the proceeds returned to me along with most of my stolen money. I used some of it to establish a foundation that helped elderly victims of financial fraud, naming it the Margaret Chen Memorial Fund. Margaret deserved to be remembered for more than how she died. Marcus and I were slowly rebuilding our relationship, though it would never be the same. Trust, once broken, doesn't heal cleanly. He was in therapy, trying to understand how he'd been so thoroughly manipulated, how he'd chosen a predator over his own mother. Some days were better than others. I keep thinking I should have seen it, he'd said during one of our tentative coffee meetings. There must have been signs. There were signs, I told him honestly, but she was very good at explaining them away. And you wanted to believe in your marriage. That's not a character flaw, Marcus. That's hope. He was living in a small apartment now, working through his own guilt and shame. Stephanie had isolated him from his friends just as thoroughly as she'd isolated me, leaving him with no support system outside of her. Recovery would take time. The most surprising development had been hearing from Margaret Chen's son, David. He'd flown in from Seattle after learning about Stephanie's arrest and conviction. We met at a quiet cafe downtown, 2 people bound together by loss and the strange comfort of shared experience. I blamed myself for years, he told me, his voice heavy with regret. I thought if I'd visited more, called more often, maybe Mom wouldn't have gotten so confused. I convinced myself that her decline was natural, that Stephanie was a godsend for taking such good care of her. We both believed what we needed to believe, I said. Stephanie counted on that. Together, we'd worked with the prosecutor to ensure that Margaret's story was told in court. Her death hadn't been in vain if it helped convict her killer and prevented future victims. The investigation into Stephanie's other crimes was ongoing. Police departments in Tampa, Phoenix, and Portland had reopened the deaths of Eleanor, Beverly, and Catherine. Their families deserved answers, deserved justice for the women they'd lost. I'd also heard from the families of 3 other women, potential victims who'd escaped Stephanie's web before she could complete her plans. Sarah in Detroit, who'd become suspicious when Stephanie pushed too hard for access to her bank accounts. Linda in Nashville, whose daughter had intervened when she noticed her mother's sudden personality changes. Maria in San Antonio, who'd survived because Stephanie had been arrested before she could finish what she'd started. 7 women dead, 3 who'd escaped, and how many others we'd never know about. Stephanie had been methodical, patient, moving from city to city when her victims died, never staying in one place long enough to establish a pattern. If I hadn't fought back, if I hadn't refused to be her next victim, she might have continued for decades. The thought both horrified and empowered me. I'd stopped a serial killer not through violence or dramatic confrontation, but through simple refusal to accept the role she'd assigned me. I'd insisted on my own competence when everyone else questioned it. I'd demanded justice when others preferred comfortable lies. Dr. Patterson had apologized for doubting my mental state, though I didn't entirely blame him. Stephanie's documentation had been convincing, her performance flawless. Medical professionals see what they're trained to see, and elder abuse disguised as caregiving was harder to detect than obvious neglect. The hardest cases are the ones where the abuser appears to be helping, he'd explained. Stephanie knew exactly which concerns to raise, which symptoms to report. She built a medical narrative that supported her goals while appearing genuinely concerned about your welfare. I'd found a new doctor anyway. Trust, once broken, was hard to rebuild even in professional relationships. The most meaningful change in my life had been the volunteer work I'd started doing with other elderly fraud victims. Through the district attorney's office, I'd connected with a support group for people who'd been targeted by family members, caregivers, and supposed friends. My story had given others the courage to speak up about their own experiences. "You saved my life," Eleanor Martinez had told me during one of our meetings. Her grandson had been systematically stealing from her checking account, convincing her that her confusion about missing money was a sign of dementia. "If you hadn't gone public with your story, I never would have realized what was happening to me." These women became my new family, not bound by blood or marriage, but by shared experience and mutual support. We looked out for each other, celebrated each other's victories, provided comfort during difficult moments. They reminded me that family isn't always about who you're born to, but who chooses to stand by you when it matters. Marcus had asked me once if I regretted inviting Stephanie into our lives, if I wished I'd been more suspicious from the beginning. The answer was complicated. Yes, I regretted the money stolen, the months of manipulation, the way she'd poisoned my relationship with my son, but I didn't regret learning my own strength. Before Stephanie, I'd seen myself as a grieving widow, diminished by loss, dependent on others' kindness. I'd accepted the narrative that aging meant becoming helpless, that my best years were behind me. She'd tried to use that insecurity against me, but in fighting her, I'd discovered something important. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't confused. I wasn't a burden waiting to be managed by others. I was a 72-year-old woman with a sharp mind, financial resources, and the kind of life experience that made me harder to fool than someone half my age. Stephanie had underestimated me because society had taught her that elderly women were easy targets. Society was wrong. My phone rang, interrupting my morning contemplation. It was Detective Kim with an update I'd been expecting. "The Portland police found evidence linking Stephanie to 2 more deaths," she told me. "Women who died in care facilities under suspicious circumstances. The families are requesting that the bodies be exhumed for testing. 9 women, possibly more. The scope of Stephanie's crimes was still being discovered. How are you holding up, Miriam? I know this has been a lot to process." "I'm doing well," I said, and meant it. "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." After hanging up, I walked back into my house which no one would ever take from me again. On the kitchen table sat a stack of letters from other elderly women who'd read about my case in the newspaper. Each letter told a similar story. Unexpected kindness from a new friend or family member, gradual isolation from support systems, small amounts of money going missing, sudden concerns about their mental competence. I would answer every letter. I would connect these women with resources, with attorneys, with the support they needed to fight back. Stephanie was in prison, but there were others like her out there, counting on society's assumption that elderly people were too confused or too grateful to question their motives. I made myself a cup of coffee and settled into Robert's old chair by the window. Outside, the neighborhood was waking up. Children walking to school, adults heading to work, the normal rhythm of a community going about its daily business. Simple, ordinary life continuing as it always had. But I was no longer the same woman who'd lived in this house a year ago. I was stronger, more vigilant, less trusting, but not bitter. I'd learned to tell the difference between genuine kindness and calculated manipulation. I'd discovered that fighting back didn't require anger or hatred. Sometimes it just required refusing to be silenced. The sunrise was complete now, the sky a brilliant blue that promised a beautiful day. I had plans: lunch with the fraud victims support group, a meeting with my attorney about expanding the foundation, dinner with Marcus if he was ready for another attempt at conversation. I had a life to live, and for the first time since Robert died, I was truly living it on my own terms. Stephanie had tried to steal that from me, tried to reduce me to a convenient victim in someone else's story. She had failed completely. I was Miriam Harrison, 72 years old, survivor, advocate, and nobody's victim. I had stopped a serial killer, saved other women from her predations, and reclaimed my own story in the process. The peace I felt wasn't just the absence of conflict. It was the presence of self-respect, hard-won and honestly earned. It was the knowledge that when evil had come for me, I'd fought back and won. It was exactly the peace I deserved.